Hey everyone, it's July 15th, 2018, and this is your episode 156 of At Percussion. I'm your host, Casey Cangelosi, and with me, as usual, are Laurel Black.
Hi.
And Megan Arms.
Hello.
Ben, how's it going, buddy?
Hey, doing well. How are you?
Just fine, thanks. You guys, our guest today serves as the professor and department chair of percussion studies at the University of Illinois. He has commissioned countless works that have become standards for marimba, including one of my favorites, Jacob Druckmann's Reflections on the Nature of Water, as well as Andrew Thomas's Merlin and Eric Uwezen's Northern Lights. His extensive career includes over 2 decades of freelancing in New York, establishing graduate programs in marimba performance at Peabody Conservatory and Rutgers University, and serving as principal timpanist of the Sinfonia di Camera in Champaign-Urbana, the Champaign-Urbana Symphony Orchestra, So you guys please welcome Professor William Moersch. How's it going?
Thank you, and hello to one and all.
Sorry about that stumbly introduction.
It's also Champaign-Urbana.
Yeah.
Well, you know.
Not the first time Casey's mispronounced something.
America.
That's the first mistake I've made in 156 episodes. Ben, I think you had something to start with, right?
Yeah, so I'm sure many people are familiar with Professor Moersch's extensive marimba playing career. I think more people are probably less familiar with the fact that he was a big-time freelancer in New York City for, about 20 years, give or take?
Give or take, 22.
I remember a while back, a long time ago, you sent me a copy of your CV, which was like 800 pages long, and I was trying to make my first CV, so it wasn't super helpful. But I remember seeing on there, it was just one of the things that caught my eye, that you played on an episode of Saturday Night Live. Am I making that up, or is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Could you tell us about that? Because that's something I've never heard you mention before.
Were you playing the cowbell?
No, actually I wasn't. That was during Pirates of Penzance. And so Linda Ronstadt was the reason we were on Saturday Night Live. So we were I think we were a reduced version of the pit band, playing along for the numbers that Linda was singing. So I was not on camera, but I was there.
Gotcha, cool. Oh, and then since you mentioned Pirates of Penzance, that's another one of your big projects that I think people are less familiar with, and I have heard about that one. But could you share exactly how all that went down?
Okay. The New York Shakespeare Festival, Joseph Papp, the Public Theater, were presenting Shakespeare in the Park, in Central Park in the summers. And I broke into that in the summer of 1979. I had met the composer William Elliott at Aspen prior to that, and was one of the main composers connected to the Public Theater. So the summer of 79, they did a production of Othello with Raul Julia and Richard Dreyfuss, and I conducted from the marimba the band for that. It was, I think it was five instruments. I was playing marimba, hammer, dulcimer, boobams, and conducting the rest. And then the next summer, the sponsors, I think it was AT&T and possibly Con Edison, the sponsors decided that they were not going to put money in for some reason. And Papp said, well, all right, if you're not putting the money in, then we're not going to do Shakespeare. And came up with this idea of doing a up-to-date version of Pirates of Penzance, Gilbert Sullivan, with rock and roll people or other celebrities. So Linda Ronstadt was online as Mabel, as the ingenue. George Rose from British Music Hall was the Major General. At one point, they were talking with John Lennon about being involved, but that ended up not happening. Kevin Kline was the Parrot King, on and on. And William Elliott was tasked with basically updating the orchestration. So I was there originally as a percussionist, also as a contractor for the band, and we spent a week in rehearsal. William Elliott was a fabulous musician, had a great ear. One thing that he could not do was sort of orchestrate by himself at the piano. So he would make all of his orchestration choices in rehearsal. So we had a week of 8-hour days of 2 keyboard players, myself and William Rule, the other percussionist. And we started off with the piano vocal score and went through the entire score experimenting. And I had marimba vibraphone, xylophone, boobams. And each day it'd be, all right, play this left hand of the piano part on the vibraphone, or play this, or play that. And the other comment that William Elliott always came up with was either, can you play that an octave higher, or can you play that twice as fast? And so at the end of each day, I would go home with my Xerox copy of the piano vocal score with red brackets around certain things, and play this instrument. And then I would spend a few hours each night deciding, all right, exactly how many of these notes am I going to play, and so on and so forth. What would be the best way to realize this? And there was a certain amount of I can't play this now, but this would be good to write in there, so I learned to play it. And that's how the show became orchestrated. And then after a week of that, we added in the rest of the instruments that we're going to use and spent another week orchestrating all their parts and adding it back in. And then that was in Central Park in the summer of 1980, and it was a huge hit. And it moved to Broadway, and it became the hit of the Broadway season that year. And so we were invited to be on Saturday Night Live, the Today Show. We were in the Thanksgiving Day Parade. We did a cast album fairly soon. Then they made a movie of it, and we re-recorded all the music for the movie soundtrack. And it was a great experience. I played it up. And in the very beginning, especially in the park, it was low budget in the park. They couldn't afford to hire copyists. So I was playing from basically 4-page Xeroxes of the piano vocal score with red brackets around things, so on and so forth. And we were told, you can't miss the show. There's nobody can sub for you because it's not clear what you're supposed to play, and you're the only one that knows what you're supposed to play, and so on and so forth. And when we got to Broadway, in those days, there were house minimums for how many musicians had to be hired for any particular theater. And so we had a combination of walkers to pay off some union back dealing kind of stuff. And we also had extras who became subs. So I had a full-time person on salary who was just supposed to be the first sub for my mallet book. And then we could finally start taking off to a certain extent. But the show ran for a little under 2 years. I calculated at one point that I played 800 shows. And both versions, in the park, you're on a concrete platform, so the band was completely visible in front of a slightly elevated stage with a walkway in front of it. And then in Broadway, they raised the pit up, so I was basically on eye level with the front row of the audience, separated by a 3-foot walkway. And it was basically like playing a marimba recital with the audience very close every night. So it was a fantastic experience. It's sort of oppressive to think, all right, this is what I'm going to be doing 8 shows a week for the indefinite. But once I got there, and we had costumes for the 2 different acts, and once I got there and got into costumes and climbed up a little ladder to get to my position, then it was like playing a recital every night. I absolutely adored it.
There was actually, and I remember a few months ago, someone posted on the U of I Facebook or U of I Percussion Facebook group, there was a video of that kind of surfaced recently on YouTube, and there you were playing Pirates of Penzance.
Yeah, the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts came and filmed one of the shows in the Central Park, and we were promised at the time that this was going to go into the library archives and never go public. And lo and behold, a few years later, it's put out as a DVD. And of course, the actors union made sure that they all were paid for it, but none of the musicians were.
Was there any kind of lawsuit about that, or any attempt to?
No, it's just the difference between the musicians' union contracts and actors' equity contracts, I think. We were paid well for the show itself. We were paid well for the recording and for the actual movie that we made of it. But that was kind of a bootleg outfit when that DVD hit the surface. And as I've commented many times over the years since then, I've been in various places around the world, and I've run into people who are playing our version of that show, officially known as the New York Shakespeare Pirates of Penzance. And my heart goes out to anyone who has to learn that mallet book in order to play 4 to 8 shows. and nothing else, because it's a huge amount of notes. And I wrote it, and I had I don't remember now, probably at least, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks in Central Park to sort of learn it. Everybody always talks about the xylophone part in I Am a Major General, the patter song, and it has this velocity xylophone part of playing double or triple note attacks for every pitch that the singer sings.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. And it's pretty quick, and people talk about that and so on and so forth. But the point is that when we first started doing the show, George Rose didn't do it as fast as is on the recording. It took a matter of performances to gradually work that up. So, as I say, it's a lot easier learning along the way and gradually speeding things up than it is to suddenly have to learn it for next week.
I want to hear about Ben as a student. Let's hear the truth.
Oh God.
Oh, come on. Almost all of my students were great. Ben was one of the great ones.
Dang it, come on.
Although I will say that I don't think he had the red pants in those days.
I didn't. That started in Miami. Just had a duck costume.
Yeah, he did have a duck costume. That's true. But you didn't wear it. Someone else wore it. Wasn't it Zach that wore it?
Yeah, Zach Pincoffer.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you know this, but Ben's sort of official assignment on the podcast is to do a segment on some historical percussion thing, and I think most episodes he brings up your percussion history, your percussion literature class, and just how fantastic it is.
Yeah, my first question would be, I wonder where Ben got that. But yeah,
right. Credit to you.
If I have one criticism of that class, though, here it is. This I thought was total BS. On one of the listening tests, he plays this like slow, lyrical, unaccompanied vibraphone thing, and like no one got the question right. We're like, what is it? It was like literally it was the middle of the second movement of the Schwantner percussion concerto.
Yeah, you got to study.
But it's like
Yeah, you got to study.
It doesn't even sound like a concerto. It's just solo vibes.
Well, now, first of all, if it's the second movement of Schwantner, there's an awful lot of stacked fifths going on the vibraphone, so that should be fairly recognizable. And the other vibraphone excerpt that I always remember using is part of Phoenix, the opening of Phoenix, and that's also extremely identifiable if you're familiar with the piece at all.
And if you
I just only listen to the Schwantner because they're the cool ones.
The only sort of I wouldn't call it a trick exactly, but the only thing that I might do on those listening exams is that I might choose a different performance than the one that you were listening to in the preparation. But otherwise, I'm not, intentionally trying to trick people or anything.
It sounds like Ben just didn't do the preparations.
That's
all right. Votes are in.
Oh, believe me, we prepared. We had many late night study sessions.
I appreciate I was hearing about the various study sessions. It's usually a pretty small class of 4 to 6 people or so. Because I only offer it every other year. It's only required of the graduate students.
What do you think is the thing? Because I feel like I've been in that conversation several times where, okay, should we focus on the orchestra rep? Should we focus on percussion ensemble rep? Should we do solo? Should we do chamber? And it seems like a lot of the curriculums I've seen, they kind of snake in and out of a lot of those. Do you have an opinion after years of doing it? Kind of, what we should be teaching first and foremost.
My particular percussion lit class is a 2-semester class aimed specifically at graduate students. And in that capacity, I rather assume that they're already familiar with the orchestral literature. So we have the first week or two, it meets twice a week. Usually, I guess in the first couple sessions, we have a kind of a fast version of going through a big chunk of the Blades book, and a very sort of quick review of the orchestral side of things and the history of the instruments. The first research paper that I assign is for each of the students chooses an orchestral instrument or family of orchestral instruments and does a paper on the history and evolution of the repertoire. So I'm really sort of starting from a position that they already know that. And what I'm focused, one semester focuses on, well, the class starts in 1900 and looks at the development of percussion primarily through chamber music and somewhat through orchestral music, but the things that lead toward percussion ensemble as a genre and also that lead toward solo percussion as a genre. So between 1900 and 1930, there's a lot of music that points us in that direction. And then once we arrive at 1930 with the Mio concerto is the first concerto for percussion. We're not counting the historic timpani ones. We'll get to those later. And what's the other one? Oh, ionization and the rolled on rhythmicas. So then it splits. And for the rest of that semester, we focus on percussion ensemble. And then in the second semester, we start up and review a little bit of solo percussion prior to 1900, which is primarily the various 17th and 18th century timpani concerti, and then moving forward just on solo percussion to the modern day. So compared with say, Norm Weinberg's wonderful online course, he structures that one very differently. He spends much more time on the history of all the instruments and the development of the orchestral repertoire and so on and so forth. And there's a much smaller focus on ensemble, percussion ensemble, or on solo instruments, or on chamber literature. So toward that end, one thing that I'll mention is I'm in the midst now, I've partnered with Norm Weinberg to create a marimba history and literature course, online course. And that's going to be
great.
Starting from the same kind of premise and using a fair amount of the stuff that I cover in the percussion literature course, but with more of a concentrated focus just on marimba.
Do you cover Pius Chang in it, or no? It wouldn't bother.
Yeah. He comes in towards the end. When I first started, I started teaching it in 1998 when I started at Illinois, and as I say, it happens every other year. So I'm up to my 9th or 10th iteration, or so. The first 4 or 5 were pretty dramatically different each time around. And what am I trying to say? Oh, yeah. In the early years, I basically sort of came up toward the year 2000 and said, all right, anything after this, you're going to be familiar with already, so I'm not going to bother with that. And then as it started becoming 2010, 2015, then I started saying, well, there's really some more music that's in the last 15 years that I should be including here. So Pius and others have started to creep into the back end of the version because of that.
And that's kind of like explaining the downfall of like the right.
If you want to put it that way.
Yeah, we can put it that way.
Okay. But we try to keep politics out of it.
So for me it was interesting. It was interesting because it's like the only literature course I've ever had that also like looks at the future. And it was like the last week of classes or something, we were talking about like things that had been commissioned but not completed yet, or had been maybe completed but not premiered yet. Like I think the Steve Reich Mallet Quartet was one that I heard one of the first performances of, I think the next year, 2 years later after I graduated. So yeah, it was kind of cool to have at the very end this sort of insight into where we're heading.
When did you graduate again?
I graduated. I took that class in 2009, 2010, and then graduated in 2011. And I heard that at Miami in 2011.
Piece was written that piece was written in 2009 and premiered in 10. So yeah, I try to stay up on things and you're right. Point out what's coming up or things that I've just discovered.
Yeah, excellent. Ben, why don't you hit us up with your person of significance today? Sure.
Well, since Professor Moersch mentioned timpani concertos, I thought I would talk about his longtime friend, Jonathan Haas. And this was actually a rare case where I found, I think, too much information for one of these segments. There was a ton of stuff, so I tried to pare it down to a few different areas to kind of hit on. But if you're interested in Jonathan Haas, there's many PAS articles written over the years. The 3 that I sort of got most of my material from were called 1, Starting, Maintaining, and Growing a Percussion Rental Company, from Percussive Notes, Volume 47, Number 4, August and September 2009. The second one was In Search of a Multiple Timpani Repertoire, a Response from Percussive Notes, Volume 23, Number 5, July 1985. And number 3 was The Mount Everest of Timpani Concertos, the Philip Glass Concerto Fantasy for Two Timpanists and Orchestra, Percussive Notes, Volume 45, Number 5, October 2007. And then I also came across an article, you can find it if you just Google the title, called Bangin' Around with Johnny H. by Dale Kiger from the John Hopkins Magazine, February 1995 issue. So anyway, some background information to start off with Jonathan Haas. I liked the sort of summary in that last article I mentioned. He was described as 2 parts musician, 1 part teacher, 1 part entrepreneur. He was born in 1955 in Glencoe, Illinois, and he grew up playing music. It sounded like many of the people in his family were musicians, although none were professional musicians. He apparently would bang on everything in sight to the point that at one time his sister threatened to kill him if he didn't stop beating on furniture. So around the age of 9 or 10, he got his first drum kit, and he said he split his time growing up between playing in school orchestra and being in a rock band that covered the likes of Led Zeppelin and The Doors. He did his undergraduate studies in liberal arts at Washington University in St. Louis, where he studied with Rich O'Donnell. And then after that, he did a master's degree at Juilliard, where he studied with Saul Goodman and Buster Bailey. And he also cites additional studies with Charlie Owen, who was Professor Moersch's teacher at Michigan, and Richard Holmes. He says he pursued a career as a solo timpanist since 1979, and that's when his first recital took place at Paul Recital Hard in Juilliard. And the idea of being a solo timpanist, actually, it sounds strange even today, but I'm sure back in the late 70s especially it did. So he cited sort of 2 rock and roll inspirations for this. One was the introduction of White Room by Cream, which is Eric Clapton's band, has a timpani solo in it. And the other is, I think this is while he was at Juilliard, maybe the middle summer, I couldn't really tell. In 1979, he served as the principal percussionist of the Emerson, Lake and Palmer Rock Orchestra Tour, where he opened each night playing the bolero snare drum part in a spotlight solo in front of 75,000 people. And he said every single night, Carl Palmer would take a 25-minute drum solo, and in that drum solo, there was like a 10-minute timpani feature as one of the highlights, and the crowd always loved it. So I guess that was part of what set him off toward wanting to do a solo timpani career. So around, I think it was 1979 or so, he wanted to do he had the idea to do a recital in Carnegie Hall. And so I love this. He applied for a grant from the Martha Baird Rockefeller Foundation to help fund that recital, and he received a reply. And it said, "Dear Mr. Haas, thank you for your interest in applying to the Martha Baird Rockefeller Foundation Music Grant. We regretfully must inform you that we can only fund musical instruments."
Of course.
So
Jeez.
he went back and forth several correspondences. He convinced them to let him audition for them, and they let him audition, and then they again declined. So he decided to foot the bill himself for somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 for this solo recital. And he was lucky that an administrator from the Rockefeller Foundation was in the audience for that recital. Afterwards, she came backstage and she told him they would be writing a check to cover all of his expenses. So he did finally get funded after the recital was over. And that recital was May 19th, 1980. That was his Carnegie Hall debut recital of chamber and solo works for timpani. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this was the concert that Erwin Bazelon's partnership for timpani and marimba was premiered with Professor Moersch.
It was the New York premiere of it, yes.
Gotcha. And so Haas said, "What I learned from this experience is that no doesn't mean no. It just means it's going to take a lot longer to accomplish my goals than if I had been given a yes." So this sort of fired off the beginning of his solo timpani career, and a lot of his early solo repertoire included 18th century timpani concertos, which bizarrely I would have never guessed until I took the percussion literature course. They're 18th century timpani concertos for like 6 or 8 timpani. Some of the names are George Druschetsky, Johann Christian Fischer, Johann Melchior Molter, and Christoph Graupner, which were apparently very difficult to get a hold of during this Cold War era in Eastern Europe. So they kind of relied on favors from friends and people smuggling things out of Eastern Europe and so on. But Mr. Haas was able to eventually get a hold on these, and he actually recorded an album, I I think the album is called 18th Century Timpani Concerti, which I can't find in my notes right now, but it's out there if you Google, look for it. So anyway, after this, he wanted to start commissioning composers who he said were partial to writing for timpani and who have had success in all forms of music. So some of the composers he was interested in were Samuel Barber, who had written a piece called A Stopwatch and Ordnance Map for Timpani, Male Choir, and Obligato French Horns, and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who had written a piece called Schlag Trio for 2 timpanists and piano, which Mr. Haas was able to write Stockhausen a letter simply asking for the materials, and Stockhausen sent them, and Haas was able to give the North American premiere of that work. And so Haas said, if you are patient and can articulate your idea, the possibility for success is enormous. So this all led to sometime in the early to mid-1990s, he got in touch with Philip Glass regarding the possibility of writing a timpani concerto. This came out of, he found out that Philip Glass had written a piece called Prelude to the Endgame for double bass and timpani, and he simply looked Philip Glass up in the Musicians Union directory, called him, and Philip Glass said, come on over, I'll give you the music. So shortly after that experience, he approached Glass about writing a timpani concerto, and Glass agreed. Then Glass got a bunch of high-profile commissions from the Metropolitan Opera and others, and it was delayed for quite a few years. Haas, in the meantime, pursued a consortium of orchestras to commission the work, and he said he rang up a $2,800 phone bill in the process of calling orchestras as far away as Anchorage, Alaska. In 2000, this Philip Glass Concerto Fantasy for 2 timpanists and orchestra was finally premiered with the American Symphony and a 19-year-old Svet Stoyanov as the second timpanist. And Haas has subsequently performed it with many other orchestras, including the Chicago Symphony, St. Louis Symphony, and BBC Symphony. And he's recorded it with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra, with Evelyn Glennie as the other soloist under Gerard Schwartz. He also has a very successful percussion rental company. So when he was, I guess, a student at Juilliard, he began to procure instruments, and he had them in his apartment, and he said, my marimba made a great table, covered and protected, of course, and the timpani I own made a great desk. And so as he started getting gigs in New York City, one of the gigs was at Alice Tilly Hall, where he was responsible for renting all the percussion instruments, which he managed to, quote-unquote, rent from himself. And instead of getting a truck, he was actually able to wheel all the instruments down 66th Street himself, and he actually made more money off of renting the instruments than he did for doing the performance. So he took that to heart and started this company called Kettles and Company, which, kind of skipping over a lot of the details here for time's sake, but it's become very successful. Like I said, there's that article earlier that I mentioned if you're interested in more information. But he said he has an interest in procuring instruments that are both impractical and almost impossible to fathom. 2 of his favorites from that collection include a 74-inch timpani, which is the world's largest timpani, and it's made from a Swiss cheese-making bowl, of all things. Excellent. And a 400-year-old drum from the Philippines, which stands at over 9 feet tall. There's some video footage of that on YouTube if you're interested. And then sort of the last area, before I do the career highlights, the last area I wanted to highlight is he also has a group called Johnny H. and the Prisoners of Swing. So Jonathan Haas came across a Modern Percussionist article about a drummer named Vic Burton, B-E-R-T-O-N, no relation to Gary Burton, who played jazz timpani with Red Nichols and the Five Pennies in the 1920s. And he shared it with Ian Finkel, who is the quote-unquote world's greatest xylophonist. And Mr. Finkel was able to create arrangements of jazz tunes with timpani playing the walking bass part. And Professor Moersch shared some of these recordings with us, and they're really, really interesting. He also discovered some obscure tune by Duke Ellington called Temperturbably Blue, and he managed to find Ellington's sister, Ruth Ellington, in the Manhattan phone book. Again, just called her up, and she gave him access to make a photocopy of the original score from the family vault. And this piece was originally recorded by a percussion ensemble that featured George Gaber on timpani and New York Philharmonic percussionist Buster Bailey and Walter Rosenberger playing in the ensemble. And Finkel created an arrangement of that for their new Johnny H. and the Prisoners of Swing ensemble. And he has also created an arrangement of Big Noise from Winnetka, where the drummer plays on top of the timpani heads while the timpanist, Jonathan Haas, operates the pedals. And then to sort of conclude our little segment here, the career highlights, he serves as the principal timpanist of the New York Chamber Orchestra, the Aspen Chamber Orchestra, and EOS Ensemble. He's the principal percussionist of the American Symphony Orchestra and a member of the American Composers Orchestra. He's performed and recorded with many others, including the New York Philharmonic, St. Louis Symphony, and the Mostly Mozart Festival Orchestra. He's the director of percussion studies at NYU. He's on the faculty of the Juilliard Pre-College Institute and the Aspen Music Festival, and he previously taught at Peabody. He's the owner of Gemini Music Productions, contracting musicians for many ensembles in New York. He's performed on the Grammy Award-winning Zappa's Universe album. He's performed and recorded with Aerosmith and Black Sabbath. He's been hailed as the Paganini of timpani by Ovation magazine. And a nice little quote from the New York Times review where they said, Jonathan Haas is a ubiquitous presence in the New York musical world. Wherever one finds a percussion instrument waiting to be rubbed, struck, or strummed, he is probably nearby, ready to fulfill his duties with consummate expertise. And last but not least, career highlight, he drummed on a tribute album to Black Sabbath. So that was like as quick of a summary as I could make it. This guy has done a lot of stuff, it seems, in his day.
Yeah, is that it? That's it?
He and Professor Moersch go back to, I think, the late 70s.
Say what? Sorry.
John Haas go back to what, the late 70s is when you first met?
Yes, Jonathan is probably one of my longest and dearest friends. We first met in 1975 at Aspen, the Aspen Festival. We got into a fight on that first day occasion. That Charlie
I think
Owen
the exact quote from your percussion literature course was, "I punched him in the face with the nose."
See, I don't recall that at all. Depending on who tells the story, Jonathan's version of the story is that he won the fight.
Of course.
Everybody's got a different version of the story. But anyway, Charlie Owen broke it up, and the two of us have been fast friends ever since. We reunited in Aspen in '78 when we shared a house together, and then we both ended up sort of separately deciding to move to New York around the same time. So when I moved to New York the very last few days of '76, and I think Jonathan started his master's at Juilliard in '77 or so. And basically about everything you described are things that I went through with Jonathan in one way or another. So yes, it's been a long time. He's been a great colleague all along the years.
Yeah, it was interesting reading his thoughts on commissioning. It was he wanted to start a career as a solo timpanist, which was unheard of. He wanted a concerto, which was sort of unheard of, I guess. And his ideas on how to commission composers, it was exactly the same path you took with marimba, basically.
Pretty much, and we started kind of around the same time. In '78, '79 or so, I was just really getting things going on the marimba front. And Jonathan has told me that he was sort of looking around to see what he could do in a similar vein, and that's really where his focus on timpani came from. And then we played together. We co-formed the New York Quintet, which was based on Keiko Abe's The Tokyo Quintet. Marimba, flute, clarinet, double bass, and percussion. Jonathan was the percussionist in that group with me. And in fact, there was one point after my initial 6 months in New York that wasn't very successful, and I bailed, and then I came back to New York, and I was in between places to live, so I was staying with John for a little bit in his apartment behind Juilliard, when you're talking about that rolling instruments down the street, so on and so forth. I'd also like to mention that regarding the Philip Glass Concerto, Ian Finkel actually wrote the timpani parts for that concerto, and there's been some disagreements over the years about Ian being credited fully. The original timpani parts were not good, and led to the original second timpanist quitting, saying, "No, I won't play this." And that led to both the timpani parts being rewritten by Ian and then Set coming in to play for the premiere. So that's basically that part of it. And also the first incarnation, as I remember it, of Johnny H. It was Johnny H. and the Sixth Sense, as in six to go along with Red Nichols and the Five Pennies. And then then later when they put out a CD, it was when the Prisoners of Swing came into the mix.
And then you also have performed the Bartók Sonata kind of extensively with him, right?
Yes, we did play it together a number of times. The first year that I was in New York, it was when Jonathan was at Juilliard, and I ended up sort of being an unofficial whatever sidekick at Juilliard. I subbed for a lot of the Juilliard percussionists in those overlapping years. I was drafted to play on a William Kraft tribute concert. I remember. So there was a fair amount of overlap, and I think possibly because of that, we had a coaching with Saul Goodman on the Bartók Sonata. We put together a quartet at the time that was called the Percussion Quartet, as I remember. 2 pianos, 2 percussion, and we entered the New York recital competitions and did not have a pleasant experience with that. I won't go into details. But yes, we have played it together a number of times over the years. We also did Barrio Circles and Druckmann's Animus 2. John and I have a number of performances, a number of years together. We had it, I think our first share a duo recital was in 78 at the very beginnings of what is now Symphony Space on the Upper West Side in New York. And before, it was a movie theater, and then after that, it was a professional wrestling, boxing site. So when we gave our percussion recital, there was still a ring in place, a boxing ring in place in front of the audience. Anyway, back in the day.
Did he ever call you to sub for the Black Sabbath tribute band?
No, that one I don't recall. I do remember when he was doing the Emerson, Lake and Palmer tour. There's a fair amount happening there. What else can I say? You mentioned before the parallels. The Libby Larsen Concerto project that I put together along with my manager Earl Blackburn at the time. Earl came up with the idea of having a private consortium made up of the orchestras to help pay for these, and that was, I think, the Larsen Concerto was the very first, if I remember correctly, on that model. And Jonathan modeled the Glass Commission along the same way. And as I remember, when he first approached Glass, the response was positive, but I think it had a $40,000 price tag on it at the very beginning. And so the first thing was, well, I'm never going to be able to put that together. So it was a number of years of figuring out how to make that happen.
Bill, that comment and also you mentioned the competition. I don't know exactly what your frustrations were with that competition, but when I think of you in the percussion field, I think of you as an advocate, and you've done so much to commission new music, and hearing of all these stories of you now that you're telling about being in New York, I'm wondering what it was like to live during that time when percussion didn't have, we're still fighting, of course, in a lot of ways, but what was it like to live in a time where percussion might not have been taken as seriously as the string and woodwind instruments? Did you always feel like you were an advocate and that you were a fighter, or did you feel frustrated a lot?
Both, I would have to say.
Yeah.
And since you raised the question, now it's coming back to me in those days. Well, let's see, where's a good place to start? I initially went to New York thinking I was going to be a jazz vibraphonist, which was my interest at the time. And it was a fallback position. I had spent a summer in Boston at the Berklee School 3 years before that. I was considering transferring there after my first year at Michigan, and I ended up deciding not. And then I was in touch with Gary Burton about going back to Boston to study with him. And he was in one of his phases when he was busy touring and not doing much teaching. So I ended up deciding to go to New York instead, and I studied with David Samuels while I was there. And it was when Friedman and Samuels were doing double image and playing all over town, so I was constantly going to hear them and hanging out with the two of them a lot. But after about 6 months of that, I had played on one recording, which was a contemporary music recording that the University of Michigan Chamber Choir came out to do, and they needed somebody to play tabla. And am not a tabla player, but I at least knew I had the drums and I knew how to get a couple sounds, and it was enough to do the recording. But it had come to my attention at that point that the jazz scene in New York was worse than the classical scene, and then it was not at all similar to Boston as far as the ease of getting people together to play. New York was much more mercenary. So I bailed and I went back to Aspen for the summer and tried to decide what to do, and decided that I would go back to New York and form a contemporary music group and go a different route. And that ended up being more successful. And as the contemporary music group got going more and more, then I decided that I would form a smaller chamber group featuring marimba, and that was the New York Quintet, which I did for about 3 years as I was beginning to commission composers to write works for solo marimba. And I was sort of working toward the idea of coming back to being a solo marimbist. Along the way, I was contacting various New York recital competition organizations. And in every case, they were either hanging up the phone, or they were laughing at me, or they were giving me pretty much the same response that John got about timpani, that we're not interested in percussion as a solo instrument, so on and so forth. And the situation with Jonathan, with the Bartók Sonata, when we entered one of the competitions, when we received a letter saying you've been invited to the finals, and it's taking place in, I think it was Carnegie Recital Hall or Cami Hall across the street or something. And when we contacted them about arranging to move equipment in, they suddenly backtracked and said, "Oh no, you didn't make the finals. There's some mistake here," and this, that, and the other. So I was at a point where I was beginning to get the music that I believed in, that I wanted to play, but none of the recital competitions were interested in supporting my instrument. So at that point, I decided I was just going to present my New York debut recital on my own, because I distinctly remember having the thought, on the one hand, that nobody wants to sponsor this, nobody wants to support this, or in order to win one of these competitions, I would have to play music that's not the music that I want to play on my solo recital.
Right.
Interestingly enough, when I finally booked the recital and was scheduled to go ahead in 1984, I was asked by Concert Artists Guild, one of the organizations, to be a judge because Doug Walter was one of the finalists in the competition that year. And I was one of the panel of judges that listened to him. And even then, when we came down to the final round, there was we had a tubist was one of the finalists. There was Doug as a percussionist, marimba vibraphone. And in the smoke-filled room, back room, so to speak, the judges actually got in this argument, well, can these instruments really do a solo recital? Maybe they should split a recital between the two of them in order to fill it up. And I had to make this impassioned argument that, you chose them as the winner of your competition. They're entitled to their own solo recital.
Of course.
And so on and so forth. And there was also an interesting circumstance. There was a guitarist on the panel, and one of the pieces that Doug Walter played was Gordon Stout's Two Mexican Dances, and the guitarist thought it was a guitar piece that was being transcribed from marimba.
Yeah, it's hello.
Yeah. Well, it's a frustrating thing about judging. It's you're there to judge the specific performance, not to judge the merits or ethics of the competition at large. You chose the euphonium soloist as the winner. It's not up to you to try to figure out, well, can they play a solo recital? Is there enough rep? Is there blah, blah, blah? It's like, dude, that's kind of not your problem as a judge,
Exactly. Yeah. The same thing shows up in concerto competitions, where the point is usually made is you're choosing the performer, you're not choosing the piece. Otherwise, the Mozart clarinet concerto is going to win every time.
Yeah. You had a student in the Cranard debut competition that you had an issue with that, right?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I did. Cranard Center for the Performing Arts, which is in Urbana, was this semi-autonomous part of the university. They when Jack McKenzie was both director of Krannert and I guess dean of fine and applied arts, created this Krannert, I forget the exact title, Krannert debut artist competition for the School of Music to choose one solo instrumentalist who would receive this featured performance in Krannert Center and so on and so forth. So I think it was my second year here, one of the percussion students won the competition and was playing some Abe on marimba, was playing some Carter on timpani, I forget what else. But after he won, I think it was if I remember correctly, this was 2000 or so, the director of the School of Music contacted me and said something to the effect of, can you help him devise a different program that will be more listenable to the audience or something like that. And my reaction was very much the same. I said, you chose him as the winner based on the program that he was playing. You should let him play that. And that the argument they came back with was that this concert was going to be presented in what they called the Salon Series, which is on stage in the Great Hall. It's about a 700 seat beautiful orchestra hall. They put a temporary stage on stage. They put seating on stage. So the audience, he's playing Safa also, come to think of it. The audience is much closer. The audience is sitting maybe 10 feet away. And they were saying this is mostly an elderly senior citizen kind of audience, the old ladies and this, that, and the other. And we don't want you to scare them and so on, this kind of thing. And I would say, all right, so we'll tone down the volume on the brake drum a little bit, or we'll do this and the other, but we're not going to change the program. This is the program that you chose him based on. And sure enough, they invited me to come to the concert. And at intermission in the recital, some of those little blue-haired ladies came up to me and said, we love it. This is great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
I just had a quick thing to add real quick about going back to Megan's question. There was a great article. It was actually like a PAS sort of pre-article in Percussive Notes from 1989 called An Individual Entrepreneur, a discussion with William Moersch. That this was, I guess, when he was sort of in the heat of this battle, that talks about a lot of this sort of being an advocate for solo percussion sort of thing.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. I'll go back and read.
Yeah, that was the third interview that I did for PAS, and it was the first one where I felt that the transcription job that the first two interviewers had done was not of the quality I was looking for. So that particular.
To confirm, there is no seventh movement of the Druckmann.
Yeah, right. So when I was asked to do that particular article, I said, I'll do it, but I want the right of final edit on this interview. And in fact, David Vai did the interview and recorded it, sent me the transcription, and then I went through and basically re-edited every answer that I gave, and also changed the order of the questions and so on and so forth. So that particular PAS article is the one that I stand behind, probably the strongest, is really being a reflection of what I was up to.
I can't believe people would just make transcriptions of an interview and publish that without the I mean, I don't, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Why do people do that?
Back then, Megan?
What?
I think the website was buggier back then.
Yeah, and I mean, you can't, now we can just go back and forth on email real quick. I guess that was more difficult, but still, I would feel uncomfortable doing that.
Laurel, did you have something? Sorry.
Yeah, I did. It might seem a little far gone now, but hearing your story, Mr. Moersch, about advocating that the person gets to play the rep that they want to play reminds me of a conversation we had with Joint Venture Percussion Duo. I don't know if you know them. They're
I don't.
Rachel Zhang and Laurent Farnier. They won this big competition and won this tour of Europe, and they talked about how the curators of the series that they would be putting on told them that they had to change their program. And we have to know what you're playing, and you need to commission new pieces.
Oh, right. Yeah.
If you guys remember that from that episode. That's just a little tidbit. But my question has to do with just certain things I hear about your story, all that you've done, and to someone like me, it's just like, wow, you've done so much. And I'm a person who, no matter how much I know about something, I always feel like I'm not an expert in it. Like I know everything I don't know, if that makes sense. And I'm wondering if in those years, especially when you were in New York and just kind of building who you were, did you have moments of like, wow, I'm just losing my confidence, or I don't know where I'm going to go next? Or have you always felt like you kind of knew what you were doing and you know that you know a lot? Like, how would you describe yourself?
Well, first of all, I would say that it's an extremely positive quality of self to know what it is that you don't know, to have an awareness of what your weaknesses are, or the areas that you would do well to strengthen or to learn more about, and so on and so forth. And just having that self-awareness is a tremendous bonus right there. I would also say that we all have our periods of self-doubt and everything that goes with it. We all go through a darkness that is more private than what the public sees or what anybody else sees. So I don't, certainly back in those days, I would not consider myself an overly self-confident person. I think the most important thing that I would advocate, and that I do advocate to my students, is to be open at any moment to take advantage of any opportunity that comes your way. To train yourself to the degree that pretty much whatever anybody offers you, whatever anybody asks you to do, you can say, I am able to do that. I can say yes to this opportunity. And I've heard that in so many different versions, from, especially recently, I've heard that from various TED Talk kind of situations and so on and so forth of non-musicians, but so many people are coming back to that same situation. I heard a wonderful interview with Stuart Copeland recently. Same situation. It's just being able to say yes when the opportunity arises. So I knew a couple turning points in my life have been in 1980, the National Endowment for the Arts created the Consortium Commissioning Program. And the first one was solo piano for Elliott Carter for his Night Fantasies, for solo piano. And 4 years before that, when I did my master's recital at Michigan, I played Druckmann's Animus 2. And right there, combined with learning about Keiko Abe and this idea that she was asking living Japanese composers to write music for the marimba, my initial reaction was, oh, someone needs to do this with American composers. And Jacob Druckmann, because of that circumstance, was the first one that came to my mind. About Jacob Druckmann's the composer that I would like to commission, but how will I ever have the funds to be able to do that? 1990, the NEA starts this program. I immediately look into it. And the first year or so, the guideline eligibility requirements were just absurd. You had to have something like 20 solo recital contracts in the last 5 years. Nope, I don't know any marimbas who can do that, so that's out. And then each year after that, they trimmed them down a little bit. And by 84, 83, whenever it was that I first got the new announcement, it was down to 5 solo recital contracts in the last 3 years. And I got in touch with Lee Stevens and Gordon Stout and Michael Rosen. I said, I think we could do that. And I had to go back to a couple of recitals that I played and said, could you put together a contract to cover this recital that I just played that I can use in my NEA submission? I had to be a little creative with a few things, but so that was the origins of finally being able to apply for that grant in the summer of 1984. And another sort of piece of advice here is whenever you're working on a particular project that has an end date on it, you always want to be sure that you start a new project before you finish the previous one, so that you don't arrive the day after whatever the big event was. You're not sitting there going, okay, what am I going to do next?
Mm-hmm.
You want to have already started a couple other projects so that the momentum is carrying you through. From the conclusion of one, you'll have something immediately to pick up and go from there. So I was already had that as the solo recital finished, and I was already into working on this commissioning grant, so on and so forth. But as I say, it's also the other story was the first time the Metropolitan Opera called me up to ask to play for them. They asked me if I played zither, and I had never played zither in my life, but I had played Hungarian cymbalum. And I had played hammered dulcimer, and I knew that they were doing The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagoni by Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill. And I knew that the zither part was basically a single line melody because Robert Dick, the contemporary flutist, had played it in a production at Yale. And I had heard about this from Robert. So I figured, look, I don't care what instrument it is, I can play a single line melody on it. So I said, but before I say yes, I'd like to look at the music. So I go to the Met. I meet up with the personnel manager in the library at the Met. And I'm looking it over, going, oh, this looks pretty easy. Okay, fine. And the personnel manager turns to me and asks, how loud is this instrument going to be? Are we going to have to mic this in the pit? And I said, I don't know. I've never played this instrument before. And he was a little taken aback, and this, that, and the other. I said, but I was reassuring him, don't worry, I know what I'm doing. It'll be good. And he sort of he's a short fellow. This was getting his name now, but anyway, he was a rather short New Yorkie fellow. And he says, good. This is the Met. You have to be great.
Whoa.
Because the Met does everything, just ethical and right, perfect.
To the music and up. Oh, it's all breaking up. I can't hear a thing.
Oh, it's okay.
Anyway.
I made a dig at James Levine, but it's okay.
Well, he was conducting this. So there I am.
Did he hit on you?
He did not. No, he did not.
Oh, come on. Are you sure?
Metropolitan Opera debut, live from Lincoln Center telecast. There I am. Fred Hinger's playing timpani.
I've seen this. I've seen the photo in here of you. I think he hit on you. I'm going with it.
Yeah. Okay. Next subject.
Ben just wrote stop, just so you guys know.
Oh, Laurel, does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah. Thank you.
Let's move to a Facebook question.
Well, you both just emphasized something we reported on many episodes ago. I think it was Brian Nosny's episode, that research about confidence and competence. And yeah, you both just described it perfectly at the front of Laurel's question there. But speaking of commissions, we do have a Facebook question from our buddy Will Marinelli. He always gives us a good question, and it is about, I think it's Merlin specific, isn't it? It says, you've had many pieces written for you by Andrew Thomas. How has his composition process and style changed or evolved since the two of you started working together?
My favorite sort of question. Andrew Thomas and I go way back. There were a number of pieces, although there's a slightly more interesting version of that question that I'll come back to in a moment. I first met Andy also through Aspen. Barry Jukowski taught a wonderful contemporary percussion class in the Aspen Music Festival in the summers that dealt with a lot of music that he had commissioned for his Juilliard recital. One of those was a solo percussion and tape piece by Andrew Thomas titled Song of the Wind Road. The piece, Andrew later withdrew the piece, so it's no longer available. But that was how I first became aware of Andy Thomas. I remember one of my fellow students at Michigan did that piece on his recital. Andy came out, sat up in the front row of the recital hall with a bag that he reached into and pulled out some knitting and sat there doing his knitting. Charlie Owen was a little taken aback by that, but at any rate. The Contemporary Chamber Ensemble, Musical Elements, that I had in New York, commissioned a piece from Andrew Thomas, In Memoriam, if I remember correctly, that I really enjoyed. And so the first thing that I seem to recall doing was when I put together the New York Quintet, I asked Andrew to write a piece for that instrumentation. His piece is called Dances for Five, which the Battery Dance Company in New York ended up choreographing, and we did a number of live performances for them over the years. I think that was the piece that led into Merlin. I have in my timetable, right? Yeah. I asked Andrew for a solo piece. He came up with Merlin. The story that he often tells is he was in Los Altos, California for the summer. He made the first movement. And in the very beginning, the piece was 2 movements from marimba. And I told him, no, that title's already been taken. You can't call it that. You got to come up with something else.
Right.
And my other response was that the first movement looks pretty easy. Are you going to write, anything a little harder? And he came back and said, just wait for the second movement. Okay, fine.
So it's your fault.
Yeah. Then
I thought you can say you need to.
I can just hear the phone call like, so how are your octaves?
Well, and actually, I'll come back to that in a moment. And then after writing Merlin, then to back up a step, for my previous recital, Richard Rodney Bennett had offered to write a solo piece, and that's where After Syrinx 2 came from. And then after doing that solo piece, Richard said, I'd be interested in writing a concerto for you, but you have to line up a performance first. So that's where the Richard Rodney Bennett concerto came from. And sort of in the same way, after Andy wrote Merlin, then we started talking about the idea of a concerto for marimba. And it was the same thing. Andy said, okay, you have to line up a performance first. And we applied for some grants and got turned down. Those were the first grants that I did not get, that I applied for. And we found it to be very frustrating to go through all the effort of the grant applications and the time, and then not to get the money, and then to be sitting there going, okay, how are we going to make this project work and come together? So it did finally come together. As I remember, I think my parents ended up commissioning it or putting up the money for it. But in the meantime, Andy had written a piece for Marin Boleyn, for Nancy Zaltzman and Sharon, entitled The Great Spangled Fritillary. And so when he came back to writing Loving Mad Tom, the marimba concerto, it was not based on the compositional style that he had used in Merlin, which is what I was hoping for. I was expecting Merlin with orchestra. Instead, he wrote it more in the vein of The Great Spangled Fritillary, which is different and not so much what I was looking for at the time. I enjoyed performing the piece and all that, but I don't believe I've played it since the premiere. But as I mentioned before, I think the more interesting aspect in regard to Andrew Thomas is not the growth that he went through in writing for me specifically, but he has written for 4 different marimbas now. He wrote Merlin for me. He wrote The Great Spangled Fritillary for Nancy. He wrote Wind for Makoto Nakura, and he wrote Valse Trieste for what's his name? Simon
Boyar?
Yeah. And each of those pieces is based on either the physical characteristics or the playing style or so on and so forth of those players. So as Andy described it, so I have the wingspan of an albatross. So the idea of writing 2-part counterpoint, very separated physically, came to his mind. And that's what happens in Merlin. And that's why people who are not so gifted in that nature have a harder time with it. After I did my London debut recital in '86, James Blades brought a young Evelyn Glennie to that recital, came backstage beforehand to wish me well, which I was very touched by. And then afterward, there were a half dozen British marimbas, and they were all sort of maybe no taller than 5.5 feet at the most. And they were all looking at me saying, this is great music, but how are we supposed to be playing this? How do you expect us to play this? We can't reach, both ends of the marimba at the same time, so on and so forth. So anyway, so Merlin is based on that idea. Makoto was a student of Michiko Takahashi, who is the other grand dame of the Japanese marimba world, and is considerably more athletic than Keiko Abe, if you're not familiar with her. And so Makoto's main strength is his incredible hand speed. So Wind is really written to take advantage of that. And it also includes a 6 mallet section in it because Makoto had asked for one. And then the piece for Nancy is different in its own way. And then Simon, when Simon came along, he apparently came out of a background of a lot of drum corps stuff and a lot of drum corps snare drumming. And so there's a lot of incorporation into Valse Trieste of that sort of hand and rhythmic activity going on. So Andy has really tailored each one of these pieces very specifically for the player that he was writing it for. And the growth through those pieces reflects each of those players more so than anything about my particular relationship with Andrew Thomas.
Well, I just had one quick question. I've always enjoyed the concept of like figuring out your educational lineage and who your teachers were and so forth. And I've known for a very long time that you studied with Charlie Owen, but I don't really think I've ever heard you talk in depth about what it was like to study with Charlie Owen. So could you tell us just sort of in brief what your Charlie Owen experience was like?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to be completely honest, my very first, I started drums in 6th grade only because I saw my best friends in 5th grade getting to lead to take drum lessons. And I thought, oh, that looks like a good idea. So my very first drum teacher was a Michigan graduate named Jerry Hartwig, who was the percussion instructor at the Interlochen Arts Academy after that for a while. But he was a fantastic musician, and he was one of the original percussionists in what became the University of Michigan Contemporary Directions Ensemble, their new music ensemble. So because I was taking lessons from him, I would go hear him play in all of these contemporary music concerts. And that, as much as any other kind of music, was the music that I grew up listening to, which may explain a fair amount along the way. But at any rate, then when I first encountered a marimba in high school, I was taking lessons with Gary Cook, who was a student at Michigan at the time. And Gordon Stout was 2 years ahead of me at the other high school in Ann Arbor, so we would run into each other on occasion at the solo ensemble competitions and so on and so forth. And James Salmon was the percussion professor at Michigan, who I auditioned for. And then after getting into Michigan, he retired, and they were hiring somebody named Charles Owen from the Philadelphia Orchestra to come to Michigan. I had no idea who he was, and I was intending to go to Michigan just to try music out for a year and then to transfer to an East Coast conservatory somewhere to study with an orchestra player. And Charlie ended up, first of all, he was the mallet player as well as the cymbal player in Philadelphia. He had played the existing marimba concerti. He ended up being a fabulous person for me to run into at that point in my life. So after, I guess, the first year when I was thinking of transferring to Berkeley, one of the reasons was, well, now I can just stay at Michigan and study with a top orchestral person. I don't have to go to one of these other conservatories. So Charlie was he and I hit it off immediately. He was a second father to me. And the thing that probably had the biggest impact on me was that he was all about, first of all, the quality of the sound that you were producing, and second of all, the shape of the phrase that you were making. And after the first or second year, whenever it was that I discovered Keiko Abe, and I started bringing in all that crazy new Japanese stuff and playing it for Charlie, he had no idea what the music was doing necessarily, but he always had a comment about either the sound or the phrasing or what it was that I was trying to get across. So even though he didn't know the pieces or have any familiarity with the styles, he always had useful things to comment on. So I would not trade that for anything. And then I had an additional 4 summers with him in Aspen along the way. And that's, you mentioned before when Jonathan Haas studied with Charlie Owen. That was the situation there. It was when they were both at Aspen. So he was just fabulous. I loved it. Highly recommended it. And there were various issues. At one time, I remember I was playing something for the dance department, where I was basically improvising a percussion score for a modern dance situation. It was in the Power Center, one of the big performance spaces in Ann Arbor. And we were at the dress rehearsal. I'm all alone in the pit with this huge setup, facing the stage, so I can watch the dancers playing, so on and so forth. We get through a run through, and suddenly there's this applause behind me. And I turn around, and Charlie's there, and the Boston Symphony's in town. He's brought all the percussionists to hear this thing that I'm doing.
That's cool.
So Vic Firth and Charlie Smith and Epstein and a whole bunch of them are just sitting there. Like,
No pressure.
Yeah. So that sort of thing. Then I remember he came to New York, and he came to see Pirates of Penzance when that was on Broadway, and I had written. It had marimba and vibraphone, a fair amount of formella kind of stuff there, and then it had this velocity xylophone, sort of George Hamilton Green kind of stuff. But there was one number in the second act with Cat-Like Tread where I had written a big orchestral cymbal part that I put in there, and that was basically a tribute to Charlie. And at the end of this whole show, when I saw him afterwards, what was the one comment that he made? He said, "Really like cymbal crashes." So Charlie had a very profound effect on me. Then the two other things that tie in with that, one was in 1984 I did my debut recital. 1984 I went back to, PASIC was in Ann Arbor. I went back and I played there, and that was just after Charlie had retired from Michigan, and the last time that I saw him. And the New York Philharmonic had announced the opening for principal percussion. And I was thinking of taking the audition. And the only orchestra audition, I'd taken 2 auditions for the Met, and I ended up taking this one for the New York Philharmonic, all because it cost me no more than a subway token in order to go. And I remember discussing it with Charlie when I was in Ann Arbor, and he had basically a fairly negative reaction to it, which really surprised me. And then a little bit, let's see, when was that? A little bit later, he wrote me a long letter, back in the days when people wrote letters, and laid out, explained himself a little further. And basically he was saying that I had always wanted to develop this solo career, and I was just beginning to get that established. And he was saying that if I wanted the orchestra job, he was sure that I could get it and I could do a great job at it. But if I had an orchestra job, that would be the end of any solo career, that I wouldn't have time to do the solo stuff. And he was basically advising me not to be dissuaded from pursuing the solo idea. Getting all choked up here just thinking about him.
Cool.
So that was better that I had that fuller explanation. And then the second part is that then that spring, he passed away on my birthday, and that was just devastating. I was out of commission for about a week after that point. So,
yeah, thanks for sharing. That's cool.
So, to the extent possible, I try to share as much of him and those experiences as I can with the students that I have. And Charlie had studied with Goodman, studied timpani with Goodman. He'd studied with George Hamilton Green. I don't know if it was just from the correspondence course or what, but there was some connection between the two of them there. Yeah, that's enough.
That's great.
Well, yeah, thanks so much for sharing. Like I said, it's just so cool to me that I can, or all of us can trace our lineage to Nancy Zeltzman or, whoever our big name teachers are. And it's so cool to me to have you as a teacher with all that you've done for the field and be able to consider myself a grand student of Charlie Owen and a great grand student of George Hamilton Green. I think it's just a very cool thing.
Yeah, well said. And Ben, I think you showed me a lick or something once, so I'm going to now say I'm on that lineage too. I think that's fine. Well, you guys, I know we're a bit over time, but I really would like to try to introduce, hopefully, a new weekly segment. I don't think any of our segments manage to be weekly. There's just too much to talk about. But we've gone past 150 episodes now, so I thought it would be kind of cool to start a little, like, somewhat trivia review game. So all these questions are, and they're for Megan, Ben, and Laurel. And of course, Mr. Moersch, if you want to steal one, that is perfectly fine. You are welcome to take points away from these guys. And I'll keep score every week. And I don't know, after so many episodes or something, I will, I don't know, we'll have a score card or whatever, or announcement. So I think. So, okay, yeah, so listen, the only rules are that you have to wait for the question to be over before you can answer. And again, all these questions come from the podcast. They're all something we've covered in the past, 155 episodes. So I'll let you know when I'm done asking the question by hitting this singing bowl. That's right, it's going to be way professional.
That's the sound of our buzzers.
So, and the other rule is that if you answer a question that happens to be from your own segment, I'm only going to score you half the points that it's worth. All today's questions happen to be just worth 2 points. So that's how we'll do it. And I don't know, let's give it a go. So are you guys ready?
Yes.
Ready?
Oh boy, it's going to be intense.
Ready.
Yeah.
Can we make Professor Moersch try and answer first? This is his percussion literature test.
I'm just noticing this text down here. Okay, thank you.
All right, I'm gonna use this metronome to make it feel like it's timed. It's not timed at all.
No.
But it's gonna seem
Ding, ding, ding,
it's gonna seem more like a game show. Can you guys hear that? All right.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, I like how this is going. Okay, question 1. This yearly world-famous music competition will take place starting in just a couple days, actually. It'll go from July 20th to the 28th. Its name comes from the Dutch phrase doden tap toe, which means turn off the tap. This is meant to tell the soldiers to stop drinking beer and return to their barracks, so it was reported. So this competition is called the what?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Who got it?
Professor Moersch got it.
I think
I got
it.
Yeah, that's right. This is the Basel tattoo. This is something Megan reported on back, all the way back on episode 2. I dug that one out. So, okay. All right. 2 points for Professor Moersch. Okay. Question 2. This percussion instrument is called for in Wagner's opera Parsifal. It goes by several names. They are Parsifal bells, Parsifal chimes, Monslavant bells, and what other name?
Grail bells.
Was that Laurel?
Yeah.
Good job. Yes. Yeah. So Wagner actually called them Grail bells. I reported on this, I don't know, just a few episodes ago. Episode 153. So although like Grail, that's not an instrument. Grail bells, what kind of bells are those? Well, he's referring to the place where the Holy Grail is in the opera Parsifal. So, yeah, good job, Laurel.
Only the limited pass.
If I could interrupt, so the Degen Parsifal bells then, which are just a regular glockenspiel with resonators.
Yeah.
There's no particular connection to what Wagner is asking for necessarily.
That is correct. And actually, when they reported on that segment, I was like, well, if anyone knows why the Degen bells are called Parsifal bells, it would be William Moersch. And so apparently you don't know either.
So I don't know.
There we go. Well, and that proved to be pretty confusing for me when I was doing my little runaround to look up more about this instrument. I keep seeing Parsifal bells. Well, I know that's a Glock. What does that have to do with Parsifal? It must have something to do with it. Yeah. So great. Thank you for confirming that it has nothing to do with it. Okay, last question. So I'm gonna give you guys a hint on this one because it's a little specific, and the answer was just done quickly in passing on this segment. So your hint is an 80s metal band, and one of my favorite 80s metal bands. So after performing at the International Women's Brass Conference in New Jersey, Laurel reported on a study regarding men's categorical character perceptions when meeting new women in a work setting, such as the office or orchestra or something like that, when you meet a new woman. And she saw a lecture where the research reported that men have 4 archetypical perceptions when meeting a new woman. They are: 1, they perceive them as the mother figure; 2, the seductress; 3, the kid sister type; and the what?
Iron Maiden.
That's right. So that's one of Laurel's. Yeah, come on. See, that's why I gave you the hint, because that was not.
That helped. Yeah.
Yeah, that was not an easy one. I think even for Laurel, who did the segment, to find. Okay, you guys. So the score is 3-0-0 for now.
Good game.
Votes. Yeah, good game. Well done. Well played. Hey, well, you guys, man, Professor Moersch, thanks so much for joining us. And it's great to finally have you on the show. And thanks for everything you've done for percussion and for making Ben know so much about percussion history.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking. It's a pleasure. Glad to do it. Also, congratulations to all of you for having that 150 plus episodes already done.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, great. Well, Megan, Ben, Laura, we'll catch you next time.
Sounds good.
All right,
Bye.
Bye, all.
Bye.
Bye.